Hi, thanks for listening to another episode of the Apologist Bookshelf. I'm Gary Zacharias. Let's take a look at Neil Shenvi's book called Why Believe, subtitled A Reasoned Approach to Christianity. I like the material that he does. I encountered him talking to Greg Kokel one time on the whole DEI deal, the woke culture and critical theory. He's got a wonderful book on critical theory, which I think I've already covered. At least parts of it. So this is a book that examines the evidence for Christianity. And he takes on questions like, how can there be only one path to God? Isn't Christianity irrelevant? Doesn't religion hinder world peace? Are science and faith compatible? If God exists, why is there evil? What reasons do we have to think that Christianity is true? Well, people ask these sorts of questions, and that's what Neil Shenvi is doing here. He's really thought deeply about these issues. He makes a great case, I think, for Christianity and counters some of those most common objections. So I'd like to do chapter 2. I think I already did chapter 1 in a previous podcast. You can look that up and find it. This one's called the Trilemma, and he uses a Bible verse to start, Mark 8:29. But who do you say that I am? And he said, Shenvi starts off, he says, 2,000 years after Jesus, about a third of the world believes he's God, that Jesus is God. I mean, think about the Western calendar. It divides all of history into AD and BC based on when he was born. His teaching is embedded in our culture. We hear phrases like Good Samaritan, going the extra mile. That's part of the Bible. Said even atheists like Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett have a hard time finding fault with Jesus. I mean, they can find a lot of fault with Christians and Christianity. And I get it. I mean, that makes sense. But here's what Dawkins said. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is way ahead of its time. His turn the other cheek anticipated Gandhi and Martin Luther King by 2,000 years. Daniel Dennett, one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse that they used to say, the atheists that are part of that new angry atheist movement, which, by the way, is really dying off. But Daniel Dennett had an interview, and he said, I think actually Jesus makes a fine hero. He said, in fact, we had some discussion of forming a group called Atheists for Jesus. I like that. That would have been fun. I'd like to have seen what they did and what they talked about. He said, what is there about Jesus? Now back to Shenvi now. He says, we've gotten rid of kings in the past. Emperors have disappeared. Cities have changed. Complete nations have disappeared, but this homeless Galilean rabbi is still remembered. What's going on? And that's what he wants to cover in this chapter. So he starts by referring to C.S. Lewis. And bear with me because it's a pretty well-known quotation. It comes from Mere Christianity, talking about who is Jesus. So here's C.S. Lewis. I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. Then Lewis says, that's the one thing we must not say. A man who is merely a man and said the sorts of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon. Or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let's not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. So what's Lewis saying here? Shenvi says, we can't just pat Jesus on the head and say, oh, he was a nice moral teacher. Jesus claimed far more than that. He claimed to be the Son of God and the Savior of the world. Well, anybody that makes those kinds of claims, what do you say? If it's just a man, can you call that man good or moral? If Jesus' claims were false and he knew they were false, then he was a liar. If his claims were false, he really wasn't the Son of God, but he believed he was, then he was a lunatic. But if his claims are true, then he's the Lord of all humanity. There's the trilemma. Is he a liar? Is he a lunatic? Is he a Lord? So he said one major obstacle when you start engaging to try to find out about Jesus is a lot of skepticism about the Bible. He says, think about when Lewis wrote back in the 40s and 50s. Most of the hearers then believed the Bible is generally reliable. But now what? Well, many people see the Bible as just some kind of incoherent mixture of fairy tales and moral parables and legends. Shenvi says people see it as a cross between Aesop's fables and the Lord of the Rings. Yeah, that's a good one. He then quotes Bart Ehrman, who's a professor. He's probably, maybe right now, the most well-known New Testament scholar. And he says, considering the Gospels, this is Bart Ehrman now, you're probably familiar with the old birthday party game, Telephone. Invariably, the story has changed so much in the process of retelling it that everybody gets a good laugh. He said, imagine playing that, though, not in a solitary living room with 10 kids, but over the expanse of the Roman Empire, with thousands of participants from different languages, different backgrounds, etc., etc. What would happen to the stories? Well, everybody says, they'd be a mishmash. And then he quotes Paula Fredrickson. She's a religious studies professor, talking about the Gospels. These are composite documents, the final products of long and creative traditions in which old material was reworked and new material interpolated. Okay, so in other words, you can't really trust them. Then you got the Jesus Seminar. That was a group of scholars. And I use the word scholars a little loosely because there's a good book called Jesus Under Fire that looks at the Jesus Seminar, and you find out many of them are not experts in the field of New Testament studies. But anyway, so the Jesus Seminar, they were trying to research the historical Jesus. Here's what they came up with. 82% of the words ascribed to Jesus in the Gospels were not actually spoken by him. Wow. Well, pretty soon you can see what happens, Shenvi says. Why would you trust the Gospel's basic historic reliability? And if they're not reliable, then the stories about Jesus, maybe they're just written later by Christian communities. So he says, don't worry about what Jesus claimed. He says, nobody lies awake at night wondering whether to surrender his life to Darth Vader. Fictional characters could inspire us, but they don't demand our allegiance. So he said, if we're going to go back to that trilemma to make sure we ground that in a good way, right? Is Jesus liar, Lord, or lunatic? You have to make a case that the Gospels provide a generally reliable portrait of Jesus. So I'm going to go pretty quickly over that. But he's going to focus on 6 major areas to look at to see what we can decide about the Gospels. Manuscript transmission, non-Christian documentary evidence, geography, archaeology, Jewish context, and something called onomastics, which I don't understand that one. But we'll come across it. I'll show you as we get going. I'd never heard that word before. Okay, here's why do we trust the Gospels to be reliable? Number 1, the reliability of manuscript transmission. Now, remember, we don't have the original copies of the Gospels. There's no Gospel of Mark, the original one, pinned by Mark, hanging up somewhere in the Vatican or in London or anything like that. No, we only have copies of copies of copies of copies. Yeah, and so that sounds like that game Telephone again. So people say, well, scribes are sitting there and they're trying to copy the New Testament. They're going to make mistakes. And so we really can't know much about Jesus because things either on purpose or accidentally got changed. He said, yeah, it's true. We only have copies of copies. But he said that's the same for any book written before the invention of the printing press. So the New Testament is better attested for than any of these other pre-printing press books. So, for example, they said, take Homer's Iliad. We have something like 1,800 manuscripts. Well, we have over 5,000 manuscripts and fragments of the New Testament in the original language. So, yeah, there are some differences in the manuscripts. He admits that. Yeah. The text has been altered somewhat, but here's the good news. The vast majority of these differences are called variants. They're trivial. Even Ehrman, who's now an agnostic, in fact, I would call him more of an atheist, he said, far and away the most changes are the result of mistakes, pure and simple, just slips of the pen, accidental omissions, inadvertent additions, misspelled words, blunders of one sort or another. So we're okay. Where there are some differences, we have so many manuscripts, we can figure out things like the quality, the age, and the lineage. We can determine pretty much the original wording with a great deal of confidence. And so we can recreate the original documents of the New Testament with a high degree of accuracy. Bruce Metzger, he was Ehrman's mentor. He said the variation doesn't challenge any essential doctrine. So it's not a case of, oh, we have some manuscripts that say Jesus was not God, or we have some manuscripts that say Jesus never arose from the dead. No, we don't have those. They're all in agreement about the basic doctrines of the Christian faith. Ehrman even said, even though Metzger and I may disagree, said we're in complete agreement on the number of very important historical and textual questions. He says if he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement of what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there'd be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. So the textual issues are so infrequent and they're so minor, they have no bearing on the historicity of the gospel. Okay, so that's good news. Now, it doesn't show, though, that the original documents were reliable in the first place, right? Somebody could lie back in the first century and create this thing. So he said, let's see if we can know about the life of Jesus from people who were not Christians. So here's the second point. Can you trust the Gospels? Well, second, it said, what would happen if we burned every Bible in the world and every book that was ever authored by a Christian? What if we just considered ancient sources that were composed within a century of Jesus' death? Would we know anything at all about Jesus? Well, Neil Shenvi says yes. He says we would have some basic facts about Jesus' life and about the movement that he founded. So you got sources. Now remember, we're talking about non-Christian authors. So you have people like Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger. This is what we'd learn. There was a Jewish man named Jesus. He lived in the first century Judea. He had a brother named James. He was called the Christ or Messiah. He did some kind of seemingly miraculous deeds. He was brought to the Roman authorities by the Jewish religious leaders. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. The movement he founded was first checked by his execution, but later reemerged and spread as far as Rome. The early Christians chanted hymns, sang hymns to Jesus as if to a god, and refused to worship other gods, even on pain of death. Now, these early Christians met regularly, they shared a communal meal, and they pledged to live moral lives. Now, that's a pretty good outline. It's a rough outline, but it's a pretty good outline. Those are from non-Christian sources. So they said there are something like 23 political figures mentioned in the New Testament whose existence has been confirmed, and confirmed by non-Christian writers. So you got Augustus and Tiberius and Herod and Salome and Philip the Tetrarch and on and on and on. So the corroboration of the historicity of Jesus' life and the gospel's historical setting by non-Christian authors shows that it's not a fairy tale. It's not a myth. Said, well, what about the gospels? Could they be legends, which, might have had a little tiny basis in history? It says, even if the Gospels are based on the life of a real person, could we still insist that maybe they got fictional layers put on them, even though there's some kind of tiny historical core? So he said, let's look at geography. So here's his third point. Let's check geography out. Now, the Gospels have all sorts of geographical landmarks. You get the Jordan River, you get the Sea of Galilee, Mount of Olives, villages like Bethany, Bethpage, and so on. Said, if you looked at that, you'd have to at least conclude the authors of the gospel either were familiar with the geography and the general historical setting of Jesus' life, or they were relying on people who were. It said it's pretty difficult to obtain that kind of information without firsthand familiarity with Palestine. I mean, he said, think about it. Most people in the first century Greco-Roman world had probably heard of Caesar Augustus, but probably hardly any had heard of the Mount of Olives. It said it's interesting to contrast the geographical information that you can get in the biblical Gospels to what you find later in extra-biblical writings, like the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Thomas. Those latter documents have very fuzzy, way more general geographical references. Some, like the Gospel of Mary, don't have any geographical references at all. The Gospel of Thomas, right? Some people say, well, that may have some truth to it. It only references 3 locations, Israel, Judea, and Samaria. So that's pretty thin, isn't it? So it said, can we expect to find that kind of geographical detail to be made up later? It says, do you think just a tiny kernel of historical truth would be able to include dozens of incidental geographical details? So there's the first three. Let me go back and just tell you what we're doing here. We're looking at manuscript transmission, non-Christian documentary evidence, geography. Now we've got three more to go: archaeology, Jewish context, and onomastics. All right, so these are reasons why we can trust the portrait of the historical figure of Jesus. So number 4, what about archaeology? Will that help us? Well, actually, archaeology can provide a lot of corroboration for the Gospels. Now, it's limited, but it does pretty well. It said things like Herod's temple, that's mentioned in the Gospels. Yeah, you can confirm that by archaeology, but it said, what about minor details that excavations have unearthed? So, for example, the pool of Bethesda, John 5, take a look at that. The pool of Siloam, that's John 9. The synagogue at Capernaum, that's Luke 4. There are inscriptions naming Pontius Pilate. You got one referring to Lysanias, the tetrarch of Abilene. Do you know they found a first-century house from the village of Nazareth? They found the ossuary, that's like the bone box of the high priest Caiaphas. They found the house of Peter in Capernaum. It said, now, some of the authenticity is still being debated, but it says that all these finds show that the authors of the gospel were pretty reliable narrators, or they were amazing frauds with historical detail. But I'll tell you what strikes me as, how is it possible for these archaeological finds to be so accurate when everything got destroyed in 70 AD? And if people are writing this stuff 200 or 300 years later, how are they going to know all those facts? Well, anyway, so then he goes on and says, what about the book of Acts? So we've been talking Gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What about the book of Acts? Wow, there's so much more true, verifiable historical information in there, like cities and ports and bodies of water and buildings and locations and all. Just unbelievable details. He uses for example, Luke uses correct titles for the government officials in various locations. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The rulers of Cyprus and Achaia, they were called proconsuls. Now, take Ephesus, says that was administered by a temple warden, a proconsul, and asiarchs. The magistrates of Philippi were praetors. In Thessalonica, they were called politarchs. Malta was ruled by what they called the first man of the island. So imagine you're writing this stuff hundreds of years later. How do you get those correct namings of the officials and all? Amazing. Here's number 5. What's another reason we can believe the reliability of the Gospels? This is corroboration from the Jewish context and concerns of the Gospels. It says hardly likely to have been invented by later authors. So he says, I'll just confine myself to 3 of these. The Gospels have Aramaic words and phrases. There are Jewish religious details in the Gospels, and there's absence of any discussion of Gentile circumcision. So let's go through these 3 real quickly. So most people believe if Jesus was a first-century Palestinian Jew, he would have spoken a lot of Aramaic. Now, the Gospels are written in Greek, but there are some places where we get to hear Jesus' words in Aramaic. So, for example, that's Mark 3:17, 5:41, 7:11, 7:34, 14:36, and 15:34. Now, Mark uses the phrase, the Aramaic phrase in each case, with a Greek translation, because the Greeks reading that wouldn't understand, people that understood Greek. So why would Mark put those words into his narrative if they were just made up? That says he was recording what the eyewitnesses remembered. What about the second point that they're bringing up here about the Jewish context? Look at the Jewish religious details that are in the Gospels. He says, let's just look at Mark's Gospel. Jesus' conflict with various Jewish groups is explained to the non-Jewish audience. So, for example, Mark 7:3 and 4, there's reference to ceremonial washing. He says, look in Mark 7:11, the practice of Corban has to be explained. Then look at Mark 12:18, the Sadducees' view of the resurrection. So there's all sorts of comments and references to Jewish religious customs and their festivals, and a lot of quotations from Old Testament scriptures. So it says, it sure seems like the Gospels reflect a first century Palestinian context. Why? Because they deal with Jewishness of Jesus. He says probably the most powerful argument against the idea that the Gospels were made up by later Christians, he said it has to do with the subject of Gentile circumcision. So that was a big topic in the early church. Do the Gentiles, in other words, the non-Jewish converts to Christianity, have to be circumcised? Paul's writing a letter about that. That's Galatians. He discusses in Romans, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Titus. It's taking up several chapters in the book of Acts. You end up with a church-wide council. It just about tore the early church apart. But in the biblical Gospels, Jesus says nothing about Gentile circumcision. Now, why is that interesting? Well, if early Christian communities are making up things about Jesus to support what they believe, why wouldn't they do that when it came to how you incorporate Gentiles into the church? It says, the interesting part, too, is that Jesus is silent on the idea of Gentile circumcision, but he explicitly questioned about circumcision by his disciples in the extra-biblical Gospel of Thomas. Right? So that's interesting. He says that's what you'd expect to see in a theologically motivated fiction written later, about circumcision. Okay, so it said these Jewish characteristics of the gospel gives us a reason to believe that they do accurately reflect the words and teachings of the historical Jesus. Okay, so here's the last area, onomastics. So what's onomastics? I had no idea until I read Shenvi's book. So it's a field of study. It's a study of the history and origin of names. Oh, okay. So what they've done is that there was a historian that compiled a huge database of hundreds of proper names that he got from ossuaries, those burial boxes, of Jews born between 300 BC and AD 200 in Palestine, so 500 years. So the data shows that the most popular name for a Jewish male born in Palestine around the time of Jesus was Simon. And the most popular female name during that time period was Mary. So Richard Bauckham, who's written a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and that's a powerhouse book. I've got it, and it's got a lot of good material. So Richard Bauckham, he's a biblical scholar. He compared, so what are the most common names in the Gospels and Acts, and how do they match up with this historian who compiled the proper names? It says the most popular New Testament names match the most popular names found on those ossuaries. Isn't that interesting? How is that possible? So it says, it seems really unlikely that the four authors of the Gospels would have the foresight and the ability to write a fictional account hundreds of years later, but they got the names right. And those names go in and out of style. We know that. I mean, up to World War II, you could name a kid Adolf, but after World War II, you don't find Adolf among American or British kids' names anymore, right? Yeah. In fact, as a teacher, I love looking at the names of my students. There's some really interesting names there. So my name has gone out of style. First name is Gary. Okay, nobody names their kids Gary anymore. So names come and go. How would the people hundreds of years later know names like Simon and Mary were the most popular ones? And they're the most popular ones in the Gospels as well. Okay, well, this is a big chapter. Man, there's still a lot to go. And I think what I'm going to do is break it off right here. And we'll do a second part next time. And this is still that second chapter on what he calls the trilemma. So he's been spending time in this first portion trying to explain why you can find the Gospels to be trustworthy. All right, well, I've got a whole talk on that. If you go to my website, apologeticsforlife.org, you can look up some of my talks, some of my videos, or if you want to just listen to talks I've done on the reliability of the Gospels. Well, I appreciate you being part of this podcast. Thanks so much, and hope you're having a good day. And let's do another one soon.